seasoned travelers gather to discuss topics and issues that affect our lives. The far side is not only a place, but a condition. It exists in the furthest reaches of the planet and at the edge of credulity. It is on the outskirts of the twilight zone and beckons to those with open and inquisitive minds. Stand by for transmission from the far side. Howdy, howdy, friends and neighbors. This is your old pal B coming to you from deep in the jungles of Borneo.
Can anything be done to fix the current state of world affairs? Are there alternatives to the current systems of law, education, and finance? Is anyone thinking about new, sane models for our society? These answers and more coming up, so stay tuned. But first, a note to visit the companion blog page for this interview at alganguy.blogspot.com. There you'll find the guest bio and links to relevant websites and additional information. You'll also find nearly 500 original articles and essays covering these and many more topics. As usual, this information is being presented ad-free and without charge of any kind. All we ask is that you consider dropping a coin in the PayPal donation box if you find this kind of information valuable. No, we're not trying to retire on your nickel, just asking for a little help in deferring costs to bring this information to you. If every listener donated $1, we'd be very close to delivering live seminars online with people such as today's guests. Radio Farside is all about educating ourselves and overcoming the indoctrination we all experience in our so-called schools. You can become part of this effort by sending links to your contacts and helping out in any way you see fit. It's all non-profit and part of our collective effort to change the world. Today's guest joins us from Sydney, Australia. His name is Franco Collins, and he is the founder and developer of the Ucadia Models for a Revitalized Society. Frank has extensive experience working in politics, finance, and computer technology. Though not having a formal degree after studying music and economics, he has spent his life to date reading over 15,000 books and hundreds of thousands of excerpts while researching and acquiring competence in the subjects involved in the Ucadia system. We encourage you to surf over to any of his websites linked on the blog to begin learning about his work. Please welcome Franco Collins. Hello, Frank. Thanks for joining us on Radio Farside. It's really a great pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that we can finally have a chance to speak.
Absolutely. Now, I know that the things that you research and have been doing for the past year or so are really complex and probably a little baffling to some people. But why don't we start by having you give your website so that people can go and look at the data as we talk.
Sure. I'm going to give two web addresses. The first web address I'm going to give is where I'm actually going to give an answer, a synopsis of what Ucadia and what I'm doing is all about. And that first address is the three W's, www.ucadia, that's UCADIA.com, so ucadia.com. And when you get to that website, if you go and have a look at the help section, there are a range of questions, like frequently asked questions about, what is Ucadia, what's this all about? So I'm going to read just a quick synopsis. There's only a few paragraphs here that kind of give in a nutshell, what is Ucadia.
Good.
Okay, it's been developed over 18 years full time. 28 years all up. The previous years were part-time. And what it is, I listed here is really, it's a system of models of knowledge, beliefs, law, economics, finance, money, language, learning, and prosperity designed to help people and communities restore the health and well-being of their lives, their families, and societies, improve the quality and balance of life and the fulfillment of the promise of heaven on earth to this planet. And so it's a series of models on how that works. And just to give a snapshot of what some of those models are, on the website ucadia.com, people can go and take a journey in what we call the Journey of Unique Collective Awareness. It's a 23-chapter book there that gives an overview of some philosophical points that you find in all major cultures, particularly in cultures from China and Korea and Asia, indigenous cultures, about our connectiveness between each other in this concept of awareness, that things have an intrinsic intelligence, that everything has a certain essence about it. The second journey you find on that website is the journey of self, which you can go through, and there are 23 chapters, and that is an overview from the perspective of ourselves, who we are, where do we come from, why do we think the way we do, and what's our future. And then if you go out from that, the second web address I wanted to give is one, that's ONE hyphen heaven, HEAVEN.org, one-heaven.org. And when you get to that website, you'll see some of the other structure we speak of in terms of models, because on that website you'll see a collection of 22 collections of the most sacred texts of history. You'll find a link to the 11 key covenants of Ucadia, the 22 books of canon law, which cover all maxims of law from the beginning of history, the first civilizations of history, to the present day, and then a link to 33 codes of law which are derived from those canons, which look at the practical processes. That's about 30% of Ucadia, but I'll stop there for a moment.
Yeah, that's, in fact, one of the things that has excited me about your work is that you're one of the few people offering tangible remedies to help people deal with the tangled web that we've woven around ourselves, or that we've allowed to be woven around us. And I think you might agree that we are pretty much slaves in a voluntary prison.
We are. But, I hope tonight we will get to the chance to talk about an issue that I think is most relevant to the changing events, which is how much control do we have if we look at the challenge of personal responsibility and how powerful this is. What honour really, really is when one stands in virtue versus a system that's crumbling, and how important this is. But I would say that when people look at the world and you look at all the evil of the world, all the incompetence of the world, bear in mind that there has not been a shop that we can go to and say, I'd like to order a brand new system of law for my state, my community, my nation, my region. It just hasn't existed. What we have today is like any company that's been in operation for 50 years. Yes, they've got IT, but they've got a little bit of everything for the last 50 years and none of it talks to one another.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly the same situation. We have come to where we are, and the world is the way it is because, for whatever reason, no one has sat back and said, well, what really is in essence education? How is education run effectively and efficiently? What's the important elements of it? Or health? Do we really want to keep building bigger and bigger hospitals to the point that they are now the size of small cities? Is that really efficient? Is there a benefit in economies of scale to the patient, or have we created a Frankenstein that we've lost control?
Good point, yeah. In other words, we've cobbled together a system over a period of thousands of years that's just untenable anymore.
Exactly. Even if the people who are at the helm of our society, the priests and those that we look to, do in fact want to see a better world, and a world where there is a bit more value, a bit more virtue, a bit more care. What's being created really is almost an automated monster, in that we haven't gone back to these parts. We look at transport. Do we really want to travel 2 hours every day in a car to get to work? Or would we rather walk to work like our great-grandparents or our great-great-great-grandparents would have done? Is that really the way that we want to live in these giant metropolises? So these are the kind of questions that are not being answered in most Western and even most countries around the world. They're not being answered not because people don't want to ask the question, but we don't have the base model. We don't have the framework. We don't have the architecture in order to have the discussion. That's the problem.
And that's a really good point, and I think that's where your work comes in, is that you have been building a model which is amazingly simple in its complexity, and perhaps maybe you can describe that for us a little bit.
Sure. I'll bear in mind that going from simple to complex can be on Ucadia, and any complex model can be measured in seconds. So
yeah. Yeah.
Try not to go over. But really what we're saying in practical terms is this. If we want to have sustainable health, then we've got to work out what is health. And then we've got to tackle some of the key issues in health. For example, I'll give you a practical example. 100 years ago, 95% or more of painkillers were naturally grown and none were patented. Mm-hmm. Therefore, their costs were extremely cheap and there was no burden to society other than those that were addicted to opium dens and other things. Mm-hmm. Today, globally, the prohibition against naturally grown narcotics runs in the tune of about $300 to $350 billion in law enforcement. That's conservative, very conservative. Mm-hmm. And about the same amount in revenues to a handful of companies that hold global patents on synthetic painkillers that are the replacement. So we're basically funding a cabal monopoly where we will replace naturally grown narcotics with synthetic narcotics to the tune of almost $500 billion. Now, this is a huge burden just on first world countries, but it's made any kind of serious health solution in Asian countries and certainly in developing countries impossible to implement. Mm-hmm. So we in order to have this as a sensible discussion, we need to look at that whole and see what are we going to do on that issue. Age is another issue, major issue to question. What happens when we get old? How do we approach health in the terms of separating in getting healthy again in terms of operations and tackling issues like voluntary plastic surgery and such kind of procedures? Mm-hmm. Again, these are corruptions in a system that very, very quickly create an untenable system like health, which cannot afford its funding and which cannot deliver even the most basic service.
Yeah, vanity medicine.
Exactly. So what Ucadia does is it takes a macro approach and says the model of a future society, whether it be a city, a large town of 100,000, or a state, or a nation, or indeed a group of nations, is pretty much now the same model. The difference is really economies of scale. Here are the elements that contribute to that model. Here is the consolidation, all that law that we've bounced around, discussed, argued, created, dismantled. Now that we have the architecture, why don't we have a serious discussion about these issues and come up with a framework that will deliver for us the kind of society that we keep asking for and which politicians keep promising us they can deliver. That's what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, that's so exciting, but it just seems, I guess from a practical standpoint, we would have to unwind so much of our modern society. Do you anticipate this being unwound for us, or is this something that we actively need to take part in?
Everything. I don't believe in any fashion that we need to look at revolution as the way forward, but in incremental steps that bring a sense of competence and normalcy back in. I'll give an example. Infrastructure projects that deliver back mass commuting in a localised area is going to be a good thing. It doesn't all have to be trams, for example, but trams and trolley services are a great example of replacing residential cars and non-commercial traffic in cities with mass transit, which is a benefit for everybody. Things like health, I mentioned the issue of prohibition. Changing the issue of prohibition would be such a massive change, and that's not an unwinding, that's just a recognition that naturally grown narcotics should be low cost. You know, painkillers should be generic, and they should be naturally grown, and pharmaceutical companies need to recognise that prohibition and protected markets are over. There's a lot of things. We can talk about food crops. There are more than 35,000 edible foods that can be grown in agriculture. 35,000 crops, and that's a conservative estimate. Yet we have been growing the same crops that our ancestors and that the first civilizations have grown. Maize, one of the most inefficient crops on the planet. One of the worst crops in terms of leaching of nutrients. It's even debatable whether eating cardboard and maize, which one gives you more positive energy to your body. You'd probably actually, I would say, be better off eating cardboard than maize for what it gives you versus what it takes out of the body.
That's bad. Huh?
So we have created industries that are incredibly inefficient in the way that we produce our food. So, as I say, there are not just dozens, but hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of innovations. But rather than those innovations coming across as a glad bag, which can then be misinterpreted, managed, it needs to be in a framework of saying, where do we want to go? And that, again, is what we're saying with the Euclidean model. The 33 codes, the 20 books of canon law, the 7,000 forms that we've designed into 26 primary categories, which identify all the processes of a modern society. It's all been done. It's ready to go and be debated.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've been really interested in is the work you've been doing lately, putting all this on your website, and it's a very complete model, considering the complexity of it all, and you've done a remarkable job. I have to ask you, though, what role does the corporate person play in creating the problem? In other words, the artificial person. How has that ruined our law?
I actually don't believe that the creation of person on its own has been the corruption of the law, nor do I believe even the creation of the corporation has been the corruption. When I look at the last 150, 200 years, I would say that the primary blame and what they have done to corrupt the law really rests with two key groups. A banking class that has provided negative value for 200 years to society, has provided nothing, no value whatsoever to society, nothing, when you measure what they've done. And the second is a legal class of professional lawyers that also have actually added nothing to the improvement of society for 200 years as a body. Individuals, sure. Leaders of parliament, models of society, fine. But as a body, have really done nothing to advance society for 200 years. Now, those two groups colluding together, have created such a corruption of the law that they have breached their own law. They are traitors against their own constitutions and have corrupted the law to the point that the law now is about making money, not about upholding a standard. The law is about creating a margin, not about the witnessing of justice. And when you despise, as both these groups do, in ignorance, the importance of rule of law and the importance of clean hands, in good faith, without prejudice, when you don't think those things are important, when you don't even think that consent is important, like lawyers and bankers do today, then you remove law from society. And that's what they've done. They've actually caused the law, in the form of rule of law, to be removed, so that rule of law no longer exists in America. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in Australia now in many places. It doesn't exist in the United Kingdom at the moment. And by that I'm not exaggerating. I mean that rule of law rests on clean hands, which means you cannot bring a cause to stand for a financial gain. You can't do that. That's corrupting the law. You can't bring a case in bad faith. That is, you can't bring a case under fraud and expect an advantage. You can't bring a case with prejudice. There is no justice. Lawyers now believe, and bankers believe, that the law is whatever they want it to be. And they really, really believe that. That's what they're taught in the universities, and that's what they say on their messages. They truly believe law is like a tool, no more than television or the internet.
Yeah. So, in other words, if I put a hot cup of coffee between my legs and drive off from the restaurant and hit a bump and spill it, then I shouldn't be able to sue the restaurant for serving me hot coffee.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes logical sense, but I know a lot of people who would say, well, I want recompense.
Well, that brings me to what we were saying earlier about a key issue that the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI heralds. It actually corresponds with this year being the 50th anniversary of Vatican II.
Oh, yeah.
I actually did a blog on this on blog.ucadia.com this week, and the issue is about the age of personal responsibility versus this collective concept of conservatism in the form of common good. And I'm sure many listeners would be familiar with the idea of common good, growing up and watching the transformation of Japan and many Asian target nations and China, of course, all under the argument of common good. Yeah? And conservative elements within the Roman Catholic Church and across the world, in America, have used this argument for well over 150 years, 200 years actually, since the bankers took over, that everything is for the common good, social welfare, social security. Rights of the individual were sacrificed and justified for the common collective welfare. National security, war on terror, these are all arguments in support of the common good.
Right.
The problem of the common good is that it allowed this elite, and still allows this elite, for those that still promote it, to hide behind the good intentions, the honesty of average people who are working like wage slaves to make better their world, while they feather their nest, show absolutely no moral character, do whatever they like, and in many cases continue to destroy the very fabric of society. Now, what made Vatican II significant and what makes this moment in history significant is Vatican II recognised that the philosophy behind the Catholic Church, which is this for the common good, this collective socialism, it's funny to think of capitalism as socialism, but it's, shades of the same thing.
Yeah.
That it was time for all of us to grow up. That the way forward is not to perpetuate a system of slave plantations, but to recognise men and women have the right to be free through their own competence. That we are responsible for our own actions. We are free to choose, but we can never surrender our responsibility for our actions.
Okay, that brings up two things that I want to clarify. Backing up a little bit, do you draw a distinction between legal and lawful?
Yes, I do. I mean, and the hairs get split between people saying, well, it may be legal, but it's not lawful.
Mm-hmm.
In their system, the way I would view it is the way they use the words, and of course words are constantly reinvented, reinterpreted, but the way that the existing system uses these words, legal largely refers to the internal rules and procedures of their system,
mm-hmm.
and lawful refers in more broad sense to the custom of the law, to the public nature of the law, and to what we might even call the common law.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say those two, that's a distinction between the two as I see them interpreting them today.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So you, for example, I was just going to say,
go ahead.
You might have, if you take the United Kingdom, in 1873 you have the creation of the Supreme Court of England and Wales by constitution, and the first time the creation and the privatisation of the courts of England and Wales.
Mm.
So from that point on, law becomes case citation and it becomes legal. So what the court demands is something to be legal persons and all this.
Mm-hmm.
But then what might be lawful under common law might be illegal under the private courts. So again, I make that distinction in that example.
Yeah, I mean, that may sound superficial, but when you really delve into it, it's pretty profound, the difference between the two.
Well, let's take an example. You raised before about whether the straw man or the person has done any damage, whether this is something that we can put some blame to as to our predicament.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take the example of going to court. There's a maxim of law that every civilization, until the present one, has lived by. The present one's the first time in any recorded history I have seen that actually repudiates this, but the argument is this: the created cannot be greater than the creator. It may be different, sure. It may have different talents, sure. But it cannot be greater. Another way of saying it is, what creates something, or something created, can't come before the thing that created it. That's even a better way of saying it. So, if my father contributes to my birth, then I can't be my father's father. Right?
Okay.
It defies logic.
Right.
Yeah?
Right.
So a corporation, being effectively a body corporate derived from a trust, or derived as the elements of an estate, can't be greater than the man in whose name the estate is created. Right? Can't be.
Right.
So the person can never be greater than the man.
Yeah. That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
So the corporation that brings you forward and claims your name can never have higher jurisdiction than the man standing in honour. It can never have that. It can only trick the mind of the man into a state of dishonour, and therefore justifying the action that then follows. But the will of the man can never be depreciated. Well, the testament, I should say, let me qualify that. The testament of the man can never be depreciated to the will of the person in whose name the person is created.
Wow, that's really profound. Well, and this kind of brings up the other point I wanted to mention was that you mentioned competence, and what authority gives the courts, the system, the right to determine whether I am competent or not?
Well, they've made it easy for themselves. There are a series of controls that are derived over the last 200 years that have been put in place across all countries now that streamline a private court, because these are private courts now. The only public court there is Chancery Court. All the courts, Supreme Courts, District Courts, County Courts, are all private courts now. But what they've done is they've put a series of presumptions in place that make life far easier for them. So, for example, one of the first things that they put in place from the middle of the 19th century was the concept that the poor had rights, but those rights could be centralised and managed, and that the body that managed the poor could then derive a benefit from that in monetising its custody of name. What we mean by that is when we register our children at birth or we register a marriage, that if we are poor under statute, if we are poor, then the body that handles all this then has the right to go and create a derivative in order to recoup the costs that will come to it in giving us welfare, in sustenance.
Oh, okay.
So this is the origin of what's called the Poor Laws and the creation of the birth certificate and the creation of the counties and the concept of being a ward of your local council, the magistrates' court. This is the origin of the magistrates' court and the powers of the local community, the local legal community over you, that you are in fact a ward of the county because you do not have property. You are deprived of your name when you give up your name at birth, so you have no land in your name and you have no name, so you have no property. You are effectively a debt slave. And so they can legally place you in custody and assist in your welfare, but if at any time that you upset them, they can arrest you and bring you to court. So that was the first that they created. The second they created at the end of the 19th century had to deal with health. And here what they were trying to tackle is the awakening mind and what to do when people start to wake up and start challenging the obese, corrupt, elite families that have no right to be where they are,
right,
and are wholly incompetent in what they do. So they invented in England the concept of lunacy, and they combined lunacy and they criminalised lunacy. So one of the old maxims of law up until the 19th century was that a madman already has his sentence. That is, someone who is suffering mental illness cannot be, convicted of a crime and put into prison because they're already suffering mental illness. They already have the penalty. They're already suffering, right?
Yeah, right.
So this is a maxim that was brought out in Roman times. It's a very, very old maxim that people who are mentally ill can't be held to account in competence because they're already mad. They're already suffering mental illness. Well, what the bankers did, the Bank of England, controlling the United Kingdom, and the lawyers colluding, was they criminalised lunacy, which is one of the great and I would say one of the very most evil injuries to law that I know of at any point in history, to criminalise lunacy.
Wow.
To criminalise mental illness.
Yeah.
And then what they did is they made us all criminally insane. We all became criminally insane.
Huh.
And this is why we need licenses. So to them, they have no reason to worry about our competence, because the presumption that they have done is that we are already criminally insane and wards of the state. That's where we start from.
Well, in fact, the entire educational system and everything in our culture is designed to make us believe that we are criminally insane so that we subjugate ourselves to the system.
This is why they have set up things like Trading with the Enemy Act and other acts where effectively a bank account can only be given if one has an enemy banking license.
Wow.
So the ruling elite are well aware that their survival can only be guaranteed if the population remains stupid, obese, fat, lazy, complacent. And so they recognise the population as the enemy. Why do you think they had a war on terror? That's a war on the people.
War on the people,
It's
right.
a war, yeah, it's a war to keep the people down. It's been, I would say, quite unsuccessful, the way they've done it.
Mm.
But the elite families know that their survival depends on making sure that the people never rise up and that they are viewed as enemies, and if there is a threat, that they squash it as quickly as possible.
What a truly diabolical system. I mean,
Well,
I mean that in every sense of the word.
It's only diabolical in the last 100 or so years, and there has been genuine attempt to reform it, as I mentioned, concerning the awakening of personal responsibility. But what you see, and when we say personal responsibility is not about freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is the elite family's counter-argument.
That's the illusion.
To confuse.
Mm-hmm.
Personal responsibility is saying, I stand by a series of values. I stand by them. And in fact, if you go to a website, globe-union.org, which is one of the Ucadia websites, globe-union.org, I think Article 9 actually lists a series of virtues there. And the first virtue, one of the oldest virtues, this virtue is more than 2,000 years old. It's a virtue that is embedded in the New Testament, and it's no more complex than simply saying, my word is my bond.
Mm-hmm.
My word is my bond. Now people say, well, that's great, but what about the corruption of mortgages? What about the corruption of credit cards? And what I say there is, accept the fact that under the system, you do not own your property. You're a tenant. You're a tenant.
Mm-hmm.
So learn truly what you are. As a tenant, and the fact that you don't own the property, you have an obligation to your estate, if you are truly administering your estate. And yes, you need to pay rent, and you need to service whatever loan.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if you maintain that property, you must have that investment repaid by the landlord. You must. If you don't demand the rightful recompense from the landlord, being the county or the council or the bank, then how can you argue that it's unfair? If you don't administer your affairs properly, how can you argue that someone else is wrong?
Yeah.
The mortgage may be unjust, but if you don't put a proper accounting in place, like for example, if you pay for a phone connection, you should only have to pay for the usage of the phone. If you pay for the line to be connected to the home, that should be refunded from the landlord, because that's an improvement to the property, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So you have all these people that have never claimed for all the improvement on the land, all the improvement on the property, that are standing up there and saying, I'm breaking my word. Well, as soon as you break your word, as soon as you become a traitor, as soon as you become dishonourable, well, you're no different to them. And that's exactly where they want you to be.
Yeah.
Because if you like that, they can't lose.
Well, I mean, are we even saying that, mowing the lawn is a service, so I should be able to be repaid for that?
Of course you can.
Yeah.
It's do you own the land? Can you ever own the land outright?
Well, apparently not if you're paying taxes on it till you die.
Right. So you are the tenant.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the right to use the property, the enjoyment.
Mm.
You have the right to fruits, and they demand certain payment of those fruits. But any improvement, any maintenance to the property that you provide as a honourable tenant must be compensated by the landlord. That is the honourable tradition right back to the very invention of this concept under the Carolingians.
Mm.
They can't ignore it. They can't ignore it. If they ignore it, then they can't be the landlord.
Oh,
You can't be
nice.
Right. You see, it's simple. The law is very, very simple when you act honourably. It's very simple.
That's incredibly simple and really, really exciting. I mean, the idea that I can charge the quote-unquote homeowner for all the things I do to their property and still be honorable in front of the law. I mean, that's really amazing.
Well, let's talk about another one that I know people suffer. Let's talk about taxes.
Mm.
If someone comes to you and says, give me $100,000, and you are to administer your estate and what is given to you under the parable of the talent in the New Testament,
Uh-huh.
if you give money to a criminal that comes and demands money from you, so they've committed effectively an act of ransom or shakedown,
Uh-huh.
then are you not complicit in that crime if you give them money without good reason? Yeah?
Uh-huh.
So if someone comes to you like a tax office and says, give me $100,000, are you obliged to make sure that the reason you give that money is justified? What service has been given?
Right.
What agreement is in place? Yeah?
Right.
Let's say they come and say, you originally owed $10,000, but we're going to fine you $90,000. Yeah?
Right.
The only, ultimately under the system, the only person that was allowed to issue a penalty was a judge with consent, because penalty was a personal agreement of penance. That's where it comes from, penance.
Penance, right.
So unless you agreed to it in a judgment as a confession, it's not a lawful penalty. It's not lawful. It's not legal. It's a shakedown. It's a shakedown. They're not allowed to do it. So if someone says, give me $100,000, what's the first thing you should say? I gladly pay it. I'm obliged to pay it. I'm authorized to pay it. Now, can you please give me the information I need to process the payment? First off, can you provide for me the wedding signatures, contracts for each of the periods that the services provided, that you demand for?
Uh-huh.
You can't demand money for no reason. So give me the contracts that are in place, wedding signatures for the periods, number one. If the assumption of the contracts is that I'm an employee, please provide me the wage slips for those periods to show that a service was delivered.
Right.
If the service is not delivered, you can't ask the money. Of course you can't. And thirdly, once the pay slips are provided, if a penalty is included, can you please provide for me the agreement and in good faith where the penalties were listed and both parties agreed that those penalties were scheduled in that fashion. You can't put a penalty on something without there being an agreement. That is immoral as much as it is illegal and is unlawful.
Well, and
it cannot be done.
Yeah, that's basic contract law, is that both parties have to agree what the penalty will be if performance is not given.
But if your reaction when someone from a tax office comes and says, give me $100,000, and you say no, then what have you just done to your honour? What have you just done to your position?
Right. You've just basically shot yourself in the foot.
Yep, and you can never recover.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a trick. It's not magic. Let's go to the ultimate argument. People say, well, this all sounds fine, but what happens when a bunch of people come to your door with Kevlar, break the door down, beat you to a pulp, tell you if you don't do what they're doing, they're going to kill you?
Right.
Okay, that's enforcement. So this all sounds great. What happens if they just take it? Yeah?
Uh-huh.
And that's the ultimate issue of moral responsibility, of personal responsibility. Can you can you hold the land on which your home is put, whether it be apartment, building, piece of land? Can you actually physically hold it from one end to the other in your hands?
No, of course not.
You can hold a piece of paper, but you can't hold the thing, can you?
Right, it's too big, yeah.
It's too big. The point about property is we can never own it. We can create the illusion that we own it, but we can never own it. We can use it, and we can certainly hold a right to use it, but we never own it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? So we should really detach ourselves ultimately from the concept that we own anything, really.
Yeah. But the problem is there's always somebody on the other side that says that they own it and you have to pay for it.
Right. Well, if they claim to own it, then they've actually accepted liability for its service.
Mm-hmm,
So
yeah.
why not let them do it? I mean, again, what I'm getting to is this. Our ancestors, when you think of people who came from, say, Scotland and Ireland, people who came from different parts of the world, the ancient traditions of what was known as the Celtic people.
Mm-hmm.
When they went to battle, one of the famous things that you see in some of the history books is that the Celts would fight, for a period there, they would fight naked.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons that they would do that, apart from being very intimidating, was simply this. The whole world had a very simple but a very powerful concept of life, and that was that our body is just like a car. It'll get old, it'll break down, and eventually it'll stop working.
Mm-hmm.
But what we are, in terms of spirit, is immortal. We never die.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's important in this life, apart from learning, is honour, but never to fear death, because we can never die. We can never die.
Mm-hmm.
So if you fear, if you are clinging to things, if you refuse or cannot act with moral responsibility, then the system can keep doing what it's doing. But the minute you no longer fear what you shouldn't fear, the minute you start to act responsibly, then, like I said, the created can never be greater than the creator.
Mm-hmm.
Means that you have already won when you stand in honour. And all that they have to lose is everything. Because once the system becomes tyrannical, in complete visibility to the population, that's what rouses a population quicker than anything else.
Oh, sure.
If people realise that their government were tyrants, then the survival of that government can be measured in weeks.
Yeah, and basically that measure is that if I act in honor and they do not, then I have the moral high ground.
Always.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the face of injustice, even in the face of tyranny, and even in the face, sometimes, sadly, sometimes in death, where good people are put to the ultimate test. But all that does is hasten their end. And the proof of that is in the story of, well, the story of all the great heroes of history, whether it be Buddha, Muhammad, Jesus Christ, whether it be more contemporary figures in the form of Martin Luther King. All these stories hasten the end of a great injustice and the heralding of a period of harmony.
Well, even into fiction, you have, to pick one in contemporary culture, you have Obi-Wan Kenobi. You know, he tells Darth Vader, if you cut me down, I shall become more powerful than you can imagine.
Yes. Yes.
Amazing stuff. But, you know, I could talk about this for hours, but I do want to transition into talking about the events in Europe. The resignation of the Pope and of Queen Beatrix in the Netherlands. Apparently there's something going on there, and maybe you have some ideas what's going on behind the scenes.
Well, remember, I say two things about three things actually about the pontiff. a real pontiff, a pontiff that is invested to office, never resigns. They abdicate. And even then, I don't believe there's any provision for that action. The second is that a man in a position of the ultimate power of the world, even though people may think the President of the United States is the highest position of power, there's no question amongst those that read, know a bit of history, that the head of the Catholic Church is the most powerful office in the planet currently. And for a man who has craved that position, been close to that position, has spent his entire life pretty much with the Church, to choose to step away, even in the face of ill health, shows to me a man of extraordinary moral character, even if his own philosophy has been flawed. So I think whether people feel that the man, I'll get to the third point, but that people must keep that in mind. That could you, if you're in that position, could you do that? And that's what I would put on people. Could you do that? Would your ego allow you to do that?
Yeah.
That precious. And the third I just want to say quickly was that the choice by His Holiness to do what he's done, bearing in mind that he has been, well, affectionately called God's Rottweiler there for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
Is a signal that he has overseen the conservative position of the Catholic Church in preventing contraception in Africa, in the hiding of child molestation, in the general breakdown of the global financial system, in the breakdown of morality in the administration of politics, and of all the things we've said have been tacitly approved or at least allowed to fester under the guise of conservative for the common good of Benedict or Ratzinger. And maybe he has realised that his argument of denying the age of personal responsibility, which was what Vatican II was about, was a great mistake. And maybe Vatican II now will be allowed to blossom in the Catholic Church, and we can get a clean out of the kind of people that are hiding behind the common good, that believe in nothing, that destroy our society. Actually get rid of them, get them out, hold them account. Maybe we're about to see that age come about.
Well, and this is interesting because you're probably one of the few people that remember pre-Vatican II. I assume you do.
Sure.
That finds Vatican II to actually be a worthwhile thing. Most people tend to criticize it as a far too radical change in the Catholic Church. What do you say about that?
Well, I'd say they haven't actually read the four constitutions and edicts that were generated from those events, restarted in 1963, and look through what they actually represent, because there are many ways to encapsulate it, but the way I encapsulate it is it's personal responsibility versus the end of the age of collective conformity of being servants for the common good that has allowed an elite class, an oligarchy, to maintain a position in that model for the common good, who show no personal responsibility whatsoever. So I'd say bring on the age of personal responsibility, because in many cases, for most people, it will be a greater challenge. It really will be.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that systems of power diminish. It means that they become more effective and that competence is returned, because people who sit in them can no longer do what they're doing now. Judges must, under the age of personal responsibility in Vatican II implemented, they must sit in good faith. They must sit with clean hands. They must sit under oath. They must sit without prejudice, which is not what they're doing today.
Right.
Bankers can't make $100 million profits. Bankers must be paid according to their worth. They must have clean hands. They must be in good faith. They must be fiduciaries. This is the age of personal responsibility and what it means.
Yeah, and I probably can list about 3 people that I know in the entire world that even know what personal responsibility is. We've become so acclimated to receiving favors from quote unquote authorities that we don't even know how to be personally responsible.
Well, the argument of arch conservatism, which is, for the common good, national security, all these kinds of things, really are cloak screens for this intellectual elite to market their intelligence to basically steal, thieve, lie, and live without consequence. And, I mean, the reality is that was never the design. It was never the purpose. And that's why I'm not, when I talk about Eucadian, when we talk about these ideas, it's not a revolution in terms of saying out with the old, in with the new. I mean, if you don't know what's wrong, then what does change offer? Look at Egypt. Yeah. You can go through an entire process of revolution and end up in a worse position than where you were to begin with.
Right.
So it really is a question of what do we need to do in terms of policy and structure, but really what is in essence the key to saving our civilization, saving our world, saving ourselves. And it is living a life of at least some virtue. Not asking everyone to live in poverty and simplicity. Not everyone has to live with absolute obedience. And, people can let their egos run a bit. They don't have to all live in humility. Mm-hmm. But there must be some virtue for the world to survive. Otherwise, we are a hair's breadth away of complete anarchy.
Yeah, and I think even the word anarchy has kind of become perverted in that libertarians tend to take that on, but I think they have redefined it. They don't really know what anarchy is, because moral responsibility is not anarchy.
No, it's not. It is all are equal under the law. Do unto others as you deserve to yourself. My word is my bond. I respect what I see. I am compassionate. I feed myself, I feed my family, then I help my neighbour, then I help my community. It is common sense. It is logic. It is rhetoric. Mm-hmm. It is all these things that have been corrupted and depreciated and thrown to one side as old-fashioned, when really that was the whole message of the New Testament. It's the entire message of Islam. It's the entire message of Buddhism. It's the entire message of Confucius. It is the essential conclusion of the Western model of emancipation. It is the answer to what they say when people speak of illumination. It is moral responsibility. And this, I believe, is the age that we're about to see come to the fore. I really believe it. Well, it's certainly the essence of what is underpinning Eucadia.
Mm-hmm. Well, and from what I've heard and seen, you've done a remarkable job in educating people and making them aware of what personal responsibility is and what the benefits and responsibilities of it are.
Well, let me wrap up, if I can. And I know we've sort of reached the end of the hour, but if I just can wrap up, just to give people a practical example. Mm-hmm. Personal responsibility means there is nothing to fear in any legal matter, as we said, whether it be the challenge of your home, the challenge of a bill. There is a way to approach every problem, every concern in honour and in good faith and resolve it without being tricky, without having to pull a rabbit out of the hat. Personal responsibility in not lying means you don't have to remember the lie and the truth. As there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear. If there's nothing to fear, none of those emotions are wasted or lost in fear, and one can focus on the happiness of life, even in the midst of great trouble or health, to find at least some happiness every day. And so personal responsibility brings back to us a simplicity of life that is trapped in our technology. and in the fracturing of relations and in the breakdown of the value of relations.
Mm-hmm.
It's restoring that positive message to ourselves and the reason to get up every day. So I hope people consider that it's not some arch reversion back to, some Victorian era philosophy. Indeed, it is the answer to the happiness that people may still not be finding when they go off on a dating service or follow a new craze or, try and follow some new guru. It is, in essence, that once we live with some virtue, when there is some concrete essence to ourselves, the world can be in turmoil, but we can settle our mind, we can settle our heart, and we can enjoy what is a beautiful life.
Yeah. Well, it's a truly remarkable job that you've done. I know what a Herculean effort you've been putting in the past few months to get all this data online. And I certainly want to thank you for myself because of what I've learned from you. But also, let's remind the audience again which websites they need to go to start training themselves, because part of personal responsibility is to take responsibility for your own education.
Sure. Well, the two websites are www.ucadia.com, and the other one is one-heaven, one-heaven or -heaven.org. And they're the two websites that I would go to just to start the journey.
All right, if I was starting completely cold, I had no idea what was going on, but I heard you talk and I want to start learning something, what should I click on the first time?
I just start with Ucadia. I go to Ucadia and I look at the journey of unique collective awareness, just so I can get a better picture on where things are at. I mean, I might have a range of ideas. I might have spent a lot of years. I might know a lot of things, but I would start there first before I dive into the law, because until you start on that part, as I said tonight, I just gave a third of the outline of the Ucadia model, and it may have sounded like I was calling a race. There's a lot there to read, and I don't want people to be turned off just by the enormity of it. It's not there to intimidate. None of this is there to intimidate. So I'd start with ucadia.com first and then see how you go.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you for coming on and talking to us. Does it really matter what my religious or philosophical background is?
No.
So anybody can approach this from any direction and still get something from it?
Yes. Cool. Well, no, I can't promise that. I hope they can, but yes, it seems to be the way.
Well, can means having the ability. Whether you do or not is kind of your personal responsibility, isn't it?
Absolutely. But yes, the answer is wholly yes.
Well, great. Thank you, Frank. I really appreciate you talking to us and taking the time today. And can people contact you any way other than your website, or is that the best way?
Well, I don't want to sound antisocial, and but if people, obviously we rest very much on donations and support, and that has become a major thing to help. And if people go to the website one-heaven.org, there's donations there. But as far as communication, it's difficult for me to communicate only because there's still a mountain even now to climb. So I hope people can read and find answers. And I do speak each week on a regular internal call, which people can go and have a look at on the internet. But other than that, I'm sorry, but I can't normally engage with people. I would love to, but I'm overwhelmed every week with what people and the issues they're challenged by.
Sure.
I can only hope that they read and they can find answers with what we've done already.
Well, perfectly understandable. Now, is your lecture series still available on TalkShoe?
Yes, it is. Yes, that absolutely is. And the TalkShoe program, that's talkshoe.com, is call number 90342. 90342. There's about 110 at last count, or 115 I think now.
Yeah.
Audios. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a very good series. That's where I've gotten a lot of the information that I've learned from you. But I will let you go. I know you're extremely busy, and I really thank you for coming on and talking to us.
Well, thank you, Bernard, and all the best to all those who are listening as well. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for joining in that discussion, and please be sure to let others know about us. Also, don't hesitate to drop a coin in the PayPal donation box at the top of the sidebar of the blog site if you want to support our efforts. Be sure and check out the Radio Farside tab under the header on the blog site, or visit our Vimeo.com channel. We also have a Radio Farside Twitter account, as well as a Facebook page. All the links can be found in the sidebar of the blog at albumguide.blogspot.com. May all your eggs hatch in spring. Sampai jumpa.